Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, and I'm very happy to welcome you to AEI this afternoon for this important conference on poverty, hunger, agricultural policy. Do farm programs affect the nutrition of poor Americans? I am the director of AEI's Poverty Studies program, and over the past 3 years, we've produced reports on work, on food stamp benefits, on healthcare programs, childcare programs, and this is just one in a series of programs and initiatives we've done to raise the level of attention being brought to issues concerning poor Americans in the United States. The great thing about this presentation today is that it involves my favorite partner here at AEI, Vince Smith, who is a professor of economics at Montana State University and is a longtime AEI scholar on agricultural policy and directs AEI's agricultural policy program. And Vince is, on top of being a great scholar and a very important discussant of the issues concerning agricultural policy in the United States, he's also a great friend and a great colleague. And I really have enjoyed his partnership and friendship since I've been here. But most important, I've benefited from what he's taught me about agricultural policy in the United States. And today, under his leadership and guidance, he's taken up an issue important to me. And that is, how does it affect or benefit or not poor Americans? And I'm greatly appreciative of that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vince and have him take the program away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you're looking for a seat, we have some. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be moderating this session on poverty and on the issue of whether or not farm programs affect poverty. The focus is on subsidy and other programs targeted to the farm sector, not on the nutrition programs. But our speakers today, we're so fortunate to have such eminent speakers. You cannot see him, but Dr. Sumner, Dan Sumner, who is professor at the University of California, Davis, and previously essentially the chief economist at USDA during the first Bush administration. The first President Bush administration is on the line, and he is going to begin the discussion of the paper. The co-authors of the paper with Dr. Sumner are Dr. Joe Glauber. Dr. Joe Glauber retired 2 years ago, or approximately 2 years ago, as chief economist at USDA and is now a research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. The other author of this study, which I believe is an important study and one that certainly should flow into the policy discussions over the next year and a half on a new farm bill, is Dr. Parke Wilde. And Parke is professor at Tufts University. Joe knows more about crop insurance than any living person should know. He ran the US crop insurance program for many years. I mentioned the crop insurance program because over the last 5 years, it has been the largest source of income transfer payments from taxpayers to farmers that we have. Parke is nationally and internationally recognized as one of the leading economists working on nutrition and related issues. So it's with great pleasure that I'm happy to turn the first 40 minutes of the program over to Dr. Sumner, Dr. Glauber, and Dr. Wilde. The discussants are Stephanie Mercier, who for many years served as chief economist to the Senate Agricultural Committee, and who now works with, and I always get this wrong, so it's the Farm Journal Foundation. Thank you. And Scott Faber, who is very well known, I suspect, to many people in this room, who is with the Environmental Working Group and has been with EWG for many years, and who knows a huge amount about agricultural policy and about the related effects on the environment and on people in general. So it's my pleasure to introduce this panel. I'm now, if Dr. Sumner can hear me, going to turn it over to Dr. Sumner and his disembodied voice. Normally he'd be beamed in, but this is a new building for AEI and we don't quite have the technology yet for him to show up on the big screens. and then it'll be Dr. Glauber and Dr. Wilde. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the paper and the presentations as much as I think you're going to.
Good morning, this is Dan Sumner.
We got you, Jan.
Good. I often say I've got a face for radio, so I'm not missing too much this morning, and besides, I don't have to be dressed up in my necktie.
We're ready for you, sir.
Yes, this is Dan Sumner. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
We do.
All right. Well, my role here this morning is just to make a few minutes of introduction and to orient the session. Let me state to begin with that this is a paper that we actually never thought we would write because we thought the issue was settled. And it was a year or so ago when several of us were at meetings in Washington, D.C., and we found that there were still influential people, it seemed, people we thought should know better, who seemed to claim that an important rationale for U.S. farm subsidies was U.S. food security, in the sense that the diets of Americans were importantly and positively affected by farm subsidies. But this is just not so, and it's not so because of the very nature of the farm subsidy programs, and for that matter, the characteristics of the poor in the United States. That is, farm subsidy programs are targeted at very different issues, and it's not so because the diets of the poor in the United States are vulnerable, but not in ways that can be affected by farm subsidies. In particular, neither the incomes nor the food prices of the poor are affected in any measurable way by farm subsidies. We have two presentations coming up because we really approach this question from two distinct directions. First, Professor Glauber took the lead in considering farm programs and asked, what do those farm programs do to food prices in the United States and incomes of vulnerable people? What he found was farm subsidies do very little to food prices in the United States and do almost nothing for incomes of vulnerable people. And then we turned the question around the other way, and Parke took the lead from his position as a professor in a department of nutrition up at Tufts, and took the lead asking, if we start with a population of people in the United States whose diets are most vulnerable to inadequacy, how are those people affected by the farm programs? So that is, from one side, we started with the farm programs and said, what do they do? And the other side, we started with the vulnerable and the poor and asked, how are they affected by the programs? The answer from both approaches were the same. And that is, U.S. farm subsidy programs have no effect, for good or ill, on the adequacy of diets of Americans that are vulnerable. That is, they don't really affect American food security. Now, this does not answer the question, are farm programs good or bad? That's a different question. There may be reasons to like farm programs. A lot of people do like them. Some of them have good reasons for that. But this isn't one of them. And so what we really wanted to do, as Vince noted, as we look at a new season of talking about farm programs, farm subsidy programs, commodity programs, let's move this topic off the table. Let's focus on the important things. And as we think about what we can do to help food security of poor Americans, let's put this topic off the table and focus on the important topics. And Vince mentioned a few of those. In part, fortunately, is one of the world's experts on asking about food security, nutrition, and income supplements for the poor. We don't evaluate these programs here. That's an important topic as well. That's not what this paper and today's discussion is mostly about. Let me raise one other topic very quickly. Some people think that food security in the United States is a matter of international trade. That is, the diets of Americans is vulnerable. Those diets are vulnerable because the U.S. imports food. that factually is not right, but it also has nothing much to do with the farm subsidy programs. Most of the spending on farm subsidy programs are for programs we actually export. So it's not going to affect imports in any significant way. The second point is most food imports into the United States are either raw materials that go into things that are processed or made available in the United States, that is, they're ingredients to other food items, or they're imported seasonally in the United States in ways that improve the diets of Americans. So if we think of fruits and vegetables coming in the wintertime, where they're otherwise less available, would be far more expensive in the United States, that's something that's good for the diet of Americans, and I think that's something that even all nutritionists would agree that fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that available year-round is a good thing. So our bottom line is, in this paper, is very clear, very direct, and we think straightforward enough. The criticism of this paper is, why did you ever write it? The reason we ever wrote it was because we were surprised to find there were people that still needed to read it. And that's where this paper was targeted. With that, I'll turn it over, I guess, to my colleague Joe Glauber, who's going to focus on the farm programs and approach the question from that direction.
Great. Do we go up to the podium?
Either way, your pick.
I guess I can stay here. I just need to see the time, so I have a tendency to talk a long time. Well, I'll watch it. Good. Thanks. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the introduction, Dan. I worked at USDA a long time, and there was a radio announcer there who would introduce you by saying, "So, Dr. Glauber, I see corn production's up and consumption's down and stocks have changed and exports are now down. What can you tell me about the corn crop?" Well, but Dan gave you the short thumbnail, and I'm going to go into the details. So let me see if I can do that. Okay, so that's me. So what Dan said, one of the things that came up in the meeting that we were in last year was words I hadn't heard in a long time, and that is the U.S. farm programs are a cheap food policy. And this is something you used to hear a lot of people in Congress talk about. Certainly you still hear it in the nutrition world, where people talk about consumption of calories and other things that in one sense is due to the fact that farm programs subsidize crops and lower prices. And indeed, if you look at food expenditures as a percent of total household expenditures, those have gone down and gone down dramatically. We're looking at 10%, and if you can extend this back even further, you can see this back to the turn of the century or so. Robert Gordon, in his book on productivity, goes through this a little bit, but that goes up to like 45%. So big gains in the fact that food prices our food expenditures are such a small part of overall household expenditures. But if you look at those things, food expenditures aren't going down, they're actually increasing. If you look at total household expenditures, they're increasing dramatically as well. And in fact, if you look at what the implications of this are a well-known observation, economic observation called Engel's law. That is, particularly in developed economies and other things, as income goes up, food expenditures go up as well, but not proportionally. They go up actually at a somewhat lower rate. And just doing a rough calculation on this, over this time period, you find for every 1% increase in total expenditures, as I'll use as sort of a total disposable income, that actual food expenditures only go up about 0.8%. So that's one reason why we've seen this decline over time. This says nothing about farm programs or a cheap food policy. The other thing is people point to the fact that if you deflate food prices, and here what FAO considers food prices, I'll get into, but if you deflate those prices, you see that this downward trend and that food prices have declined. Again, if I had taken this back to even before World War II, you'd seen this nice sharp decline, except for a big spike in the 70s when we had the grain deals to the former Soviet Union and other things and saw food inflation skyrocket. And then more recently with sort of the biofuel boom and other things that were going on in the world in mid-2000s. So, is this some notion that what's driving these results? Well, I think one clear thing is that, one, it's important to realize that this is not food prices, or these are not food prices like you and I think about retail food. What this is commodity prices. FAO does this. They base this index off of corn prices traded out of the Gulf, soybean prices, other prices around the world for bulk commodities. And so it really says that bulk commodity prices, adjusting for inflation, have declined over time. And I think as we'll see that that's largely due to productivity gains that we've seen in the world. Here just shows you corn, rice, soybeans, and wheat. I've deflated those just by a consumer price index. A lot of pros and cons of doing it this way, but it just shows over time that those prices, with the exception of the 70s where you had this big spike, and then, as I mentioned, from 2005 to about 2013 or so, another spike in commodity prices. But if you look at over on the right-hand side, what you see are productivity gains, and there, the blue line, it measures total agricultural output. The green line there is what goes into making the food, and that's been very, very flat. So productivity is one sector in the U.S. economy that didn't start declining after 1970, but has continued to increase. And I think we've seen those gains. There's a lot of questions about will these continue at this rate or will prices go up? But I think the important thing here that it's really research and development spending and other sorts of things that have driven these price declines. Okay. Now, if we look at retail food prices, we see a very different story. And there, you see how closely those lines are, but if you look at retail food prices relative to overall prices in the economy, that they have pretty much moved in lockstep. A little bit of a downward thing from 1950, but you look at those. I mean, those are really, we're talking about from 105% of overall inflation rate to about 95 or a little less, 97%, and in recent years have actually increased a little bit. Okay, so again, the other big thing is that the farm value, actual farm value for retail food prices, and this is one of the reasons why food prices haven't declined like farm prices have, is that you've seen this big decline in value of the farm price relative to the retail food price. And again, moving from about 45% to somewhere in the 15 to 20% thing, at least this is by measured by ERS on their using their input-output models. And, and that's remained pretty flat for the last several years. You can see, looking at various food items, just what percent the farm value reflects for these commodities. So something like beef, where that may be about 50% of what you pay in the grocery is reflected in the retail food price. You go all the way down to bread, and it's a very, very small percent. The rest, of course, is labor, the processing, packaging, shipping, all those things that take from a bushel of wheat, bringing that to a loaf of bread to a grocery store, to where producers are, where a consumer would buy that. And so, again, any sort of change in the price of wheat has a very, very small impact when it gets to a retail food price. Well, where does agricultural policy fit in? Agricultural policy hits at many stages in the food processing chain. If you look at price and income supports, and most of the bulk of the first part of the paper goes through these programs in excruciating detail, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you a broad overview. But you can see that so we have a lot of policies that affect production, and these are a lot what you think of Title I programs in the Farm Bill. We also have and have had long-standing tariff policies dating back to the early days of the Republic that keep out some things, and those tend to keep prices, for the most part, high. So you look at a sugar program, domestic prices of sugar have been at times twice that of twice that or more of what world prices for sugar are. And so actually eliminating those programs, one would think actually prices could actually come down. There's a whole range of programs that the US operates that that determine how product is distributed, the so-called marketing orders, and a big one being the dairy marketing order program, milk marketing order program, which diverts milk that's produced from the cow into manufacturing uses and retail uses for fluid consumption. And those tend to keep fluid consumption prices very, very high and somewhat lower prices for more processed products. And then you have programs like biofuels and other sorts of things that increase the demand for commodities, and that includes export programs and some of the other things that we've seen that actually have boosted prices. I dare say that most of the programs, as we go through them, either have very minimal effects because the Farm Bill has moved, as farm policy has changed over the years, it's moved towards more decoupled programs that are less tied to production, and because of that have less a direct impact on production, or they are programs that divert production, and those tend to raise prices. So even things that are put in place for very good reasons, like conservation reserve program for environmental purposes, they actually obviously take land out of production, and that actually has a bit of a boost on price. So far from being a cheap food policy, one could almost argue that there are many programs in the Farm Bill and covered by farm programs that actually have a bigger impacts on prices. Now, I go through a number of these in the paper, and again, I really don't have time here, but just going through, again, the main point is that many of these things are either decoupled or have very, very small impacts on production, and as a consequence, very small impacts on farm prices, or they are measures that actually raise prices. And then lastly, there are a few studies that have looked at this very directly, and almost all of these have concluded that they're very insignificant. So again, just back to the point that farm programs per se have a very limited impact on farm program prices, or on farm prices, let alone food prices, which are even further removed by dint of having most of the value of retail prices being caught elsewhere in the value chain, not at the farm level. So I think the conclusions here, as an old colleague of mine used to say, to beat a dead horse senseless. Most of the decline in farm prices over the last 75 years, I think, are not due to farm price and income support programs, but gains in productivity. And I think that's a clear thing. And it's actually been a very, very positive, one of the very positive things, I think, in farm policy, if you will, that has been supported. In fact, if you look at the Department of Agriculture, was one of the original purposes of USDA was to increase productivity. And then, but that most of the actual what you would consider farm price and income support programs have very limited impact on prices. So with that, let me turn it over to Parke.
Thanks, Joe.
I also want to thank the American Enterprise Institute for organizing an event on such an interesting question, asking what are the effects of farm policy on food consumption patterns and nutrition for the poor in the United States. In order to answer a question like this, we have to break it up into several parts, one of which is who is poor, and are these the populations that the farm programs are targeted at? And secondly, as Dan and Joe and I worked our way through this, we found ourselves reflecting on multiple possible channels that people may have had in mind as they proposed such an effect. We thought about, as Joe just mentioned and focused on, perhaps it's the case that farm programs affect food prices. Or perhaps it's not that they affect food prices, but it's incomes and poverty that they affect. And first you'd think about income and poverty for farm operators. But then as you think it through, you think, well, maybe it's not the farm operators, but farm laborers, who workers on farms, Or maybe it's neither of them, but perhaps it's other people in the rural economy whose nutrition and poverty is affected by these programs. And as we worked our way through each of these possibilities, as you've sort of already heard, we ended up being skeptics of strong effects in either direction. I think that if I were in support of farm programs as they're currently designed, there would be two main pieces of good news in this presentation, one of which is that we also don't end up endorsing the contrary view that farm subsidy programs greatly lower prices of unhealthy food products and thereby contribute to the epidemic of obesity. And secondly, that our comment on farm programs is fairly narrow in scope. It's focused on this claim about nutrition and poverty consequences rather than sort of a full across-the-board analysis. So who is poor? I'm going to present some results using the conventional poverty measure. We've also got results in the paper for the alternate poverty measure that takes account of non-cash income somewhat differently. The things to know are that overall, we still have a substantial poverty rate in the United States, just under 15%, and that the rate is somewhat lower for white Americans and for Asian Americans, and substantially higher for Black Americans and for Hispanic Americans. By country of origin, it's especially high for non-citizens, right? So the poverty rate is higher for certain populations, and one of the things that we'll be looking at is whether we can think of farm programs as anti-poverty programs for these populations. The other thing is that the United States has made good progress over the decades in reducing the poverty rate for certain populations, especially for older Americans. But it's been stubbornly more challenging to reduce the poverty rate for children and for households with children. And this also will come to a question of match with the target populations for farm subsidy programs. So what are these channels? I won't focus much on the price channel because that was Joe's main focus in his comments. But you can see why at least this was a hypothesis worth contemplating. That farm commodity policy could in principle affect food prices, which in turn are important in the budgets of the poor. The reasons why to even entertain this is because the number of poor households really is large, 15.8 million households. It's not a negligible population, and all of these households are in fact food consumers. However, the effect of farm programs, not overall agricultural development, but the effect of farm programs on farm prices are modest, and even the effect on farm prices is just a fraction of the effect on the total food dollar. When you look at household food security and think about what are the causes of household food security, it's a different set of causes altogether. Mainly, how strong are household incomes, and what are the other food resources available to the household. So if it's not food prices, one could entertain the possibility that farm programs address nutrition by addressing poverty. In the first instance, for farm operators. At one point in US history, farm operator poverty was in fact high. And farm programs really do, to this day, seek to raise incomes for farm operators and their households. On the other hand, there ends up being a mismatch on this storyline. When we think about farm operators' household income, all the income coming into the household for farm operators, and the median US household income, we find that during some time periods they're comparable. At no time period in recent years are the farm operator households on average worse off. And during some times that are high commodity price times, including in particular the most recent years, farm operator households can be on average substantially higher than the average US household income. The farm operators are a population that are disproportionately white, disproportionately older, and disproportionately likely to own substantial assets. And so there's a number of reasons for thinking these are not the population one would target if one were pursuing anti-poverty goals. Now, there's an important rebuttal to everything that I've just said, which is that by focusing on average, we have to entertain the possibility that I've overlooked or brushed over some important subpopulation of farmers. And for this purpose, we need to think through the data that USDA very usefully provides, which breaks down farm operator households into classes. And so if we think about the large and very large farms with gross cash farm income greater than $1 million per year, which is 3.3% of all farms, but a substantial amount of US food production. And because US farm programs, as they're currently designed, are targeted heavily on food production, these are also who gets most of the farm subsidies. The mid-sized farms with gross cash farm income per year between $350,000 and $1 million also have substantial household incomes, substantially above the US household average. And so that leaves the small family farms. These have gross cash farm income below $350,000 a year. Some part of them are retirement farms and off-farm occupation farms, where the farming part is sort of a part-time occupation. And for both of these, household income still equals or exceeds the US average for household income. And then it leaves sort of a group within the group of low-income farmers, low-income farming occupation farmers in the United States, who really are a legitimate focus for farm program attention for anti-poverty purposes. But the farm programs that would be focused hypothetically on them would be smaller and different in character than our current farm programs in the United States. So suppose it's not the farm operators we're interested in, but farm workers. The reason to entertain this hypothesis is because these farm workers really are a harder hit population. Poverty among farm workers is high, and many non-supervisory farm workers are non-citizens, and many are Hispanic. Categories that we've already seen have elevated rates of poverty. And so the idea could be that maybe by expanding employment opportunities that we could benefit poverty through farm programs. But the farm programs principally go to highly mechanized sectors like corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton, rather than labor-intensive sectors like fruits and vegetables. And the other factors more strongly would affect farm worker employment if one were interested in having some type of government program that generates increased labor demand for principally comparatively young foreign-born male workers in the United States because of their high poverty rates. You could think, for example, of government programs that help the construction industry would matter more, for example, than government programs that affect farming. What about rural incomes? You could imagine that it's neither of these direct effects, but something about the economy, the rural economy that's being benefited, poverty in rural areas that's being benefited by farm programs. But here, we need to sort of bring up to date how employment looks even in non-metropolitan areas of the United States. It really is true that farming is more important in non-metropolitan areas of the United States, but more important means something in the neighborhood of 6% of employment. The major employers in non-metro areas in the United States today, just as in metro areas, tend to be things like services and government, manufacturing, trade, transportation, and utilities, not predominantly farming. So this would be at best an indirect way to go about employment generation and sort of boosting the overall macroeconomy in rural areas. What is the conclusion? I think that there really is grounds to think about what types of programs affect nutrition for low-income people in the United States, but we probably can fairly confidently say that farm programs are not mainly motivated by those public interest goals.
Well, thank you. And they were efficient. I'm stunned at how quickly they went through this material and how clearly. I'd now like to invite our discussants, Stephanie Messier and Scott Faber, to come up to the podium. Stephanie will talk first. Whilst they're sitting down, I want to share just a number with you. The largest farms that receive crop insurance subsidies, that is the top 10% of farms in terms of cash sales, they receive 57% pretty much of all crop insurance subsidies, this being the largest program. and we have an estimate that their net worth is in the range of $6 to $7 million. That's just a number that reflects on what Parke Wilde was indicating. It's a stunning number, and it just reflects very much on what you just said, Parke, out of some new data we're looking at from USDA surveys. With that brief comment, let me now, with great pleasure, invite Stephanie Mercier to provide some discussant comments for us on the paper. Stephanie served for many years as the chief economist for the Senate Agricultural Committee, and she knows a huge amount about these farm programs, and it's a real pleasure to have her here. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, if I could get my PowerPoint presentation up.
I bet you just forward.
Do? Forward. There we go. All right, great. Thank you. All right, so I really enjoyed reading this paper. My basic reaction to it was that I generally agreed with the main findings of the paper. Reiterate what Dan and Joe and Parke have said, that the programs, as they defined by the papers, have very little impact on the well-being of the poor in this country. Agree that they don't appreciably affect retail food prices. They don't provide significant additional income to low-income farmers because of the way the programs are designed to largely favor producers with large farms and large production levels, and farm activities which require significant hard labor and not those which primarily benefit from farm programs. I think the exception to that is the dairy sector, which does use a lot of hard labor, and they have a program, so that's one caveat I have on that. The main caveat I have, and Dan sort of dealt with this in his introductory comments, is this whole premise is a bit of a straw man, and I was a little surprised to see the topic. I don't think a lot of people make this argument anymore. As Parke said, this is definitely a valid rationale for farm programs back in the 1930s and the Great Depression, when incomes of farmers were significantly lower than those of the general population. I think today there are very few people making this kind of argument. Instead, the one that I heard constantly when I worked on the Hill was this enabled farmers to produce a low-cost, reliable, and safe food supply for American consumers. The fact that the authors decided to exclude ag research from their definition of a farm safety net allows them, I think, to draw the conclusions they did, but I think that's somewhat of an arbitrary decision, because I would say the farm groups would regard ag research to be part of their safety net. They recognize the value they receive from it as part of the Farm Bill. They push for its authorizations in farm bills and funding in the appropriations process. And so when you take that into account and you include ag research, then I think you do make a very strong case that farm programs writ large, maybe not just Title I, but when you look broadly at the Farm Bill, that there is a significant contribution to providing a low-cost food supply, which I think would benefit low-income consumers as well. And the way I kind of look at this, Joe tended to look at sort of the time series. The way I consider this is, how does the share that Americans spend on their foods compared to what people in other countries do? And this is a little bit of a data study. It's from 2008, the US did. But I think that this fact has been the case for a long time, is that Americans spend a fraction of their total income on food as compared to other countries. In the US study, the US level was 6.8% of disposable income spent on food. I didn't show it on here, but the next closest to the US in that study was Ireland, which is about 7.5%. But then you look at Germany, 11%, Japan, 14 or 15%, and then you start going into developing countries, Brazil over 20, China over 30. They didn't have a lot of sub-Saharan African countries in the study, but one they did have was Kenya, where it's 43%. So ag research, if you include ag research in sort of the definition of the farm safety, and I think you can make the case that contributes to the productivity gains that have enabled us to maintain a low share of food in total income costs. So that's the major caveat I would draw for my agreeing with the premise of your study. There's a couple other things I wanted to mention. For example, where specific policy impacts are asserted, it would have been helpful if you guys had cited specific references. One that occurred to me as I read the paper was, you assert that the impact of CRP on crop prices fully offsets suppressing impacts of farm programs. Don't dispute that's a fact, but if there's an analysis out there that supports that, it would be nice to cite it at that point. Another one is it reflects a bit of a tendency to omit aspects of commodity programs or other data that don't support the argument. For example, it fails to note that the H-2A guest worker program only accounts for about 10%, so it's kind of an insignificant player in this process. It excludes the production and use of corn byproduct feeds when you have the discussion of the role of biofuels in this process. And I think you're too readily discounting the role of USDA's rural development programs in actually helping people in countryside. I heard Secretary Vilsack talk about what his department has done in the last few weeks before he left office, and he said that over his 8 years in office, USDA's rural development housing program has enabled 1 million Americans to buy homes, which they otherwise may not have been able to. So those are a few of the things I came up with, but I would tend to agree with your bottom line that there is very little impact from these programs on either the rural poor or poor in general in the United States.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Do you want to give a part?
Just before Scott Faber continues, I guess Ireland spends so little in food because they are not counting Guinness as part of food.
Yeah, perhaps.
Hey. Some of us have relatives.
Is that a Welsh or English versus Ireland comment there?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Okay.
Scott.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to AEI for sponsoring this research and for hosting this event. In light of the role that rural voters played in the last election, this paper comes at an especially important time. So it's very, very interesting, and it's also certainly very interesting as the Senate considers the nominee for the Secretary of Agriculture, and as Congress begins work on the next Farm Bill, which of course expires at the end of 2018. And so I think one certainly you don't hear the sort of the cheap food argument quite as much as you used to, but anyone who's a consumer of sort of advocacy, I'll put it nicely, around the Farm Bill and farm policy has certainly heard it repeated over and over and over that farm subsidies are essential to the economic health of rural America. And any of you sitting out there or watching at home could do a quick Google search and you would have a hard time picking among the many quotes and statements made by leaders from all sides of this debate. I just pulled a couple. One a lobbyist for corn growers said, quote, "It's not so much a safety net for farmers as it keeps rural America alive." An advocate for cotton farmers said, quote, "Agriculture forms the lifeblood of many rural communities." And one more said that in their view, farm subsidies are crucial to the economic security of rural America. Even one prominent Senate leader said even modest cuts to farm subsidies would be, quote, "hitting rural America where it hurts most." Ouch. So the truth, I think the truth that's revealed in this excellent paper is that in reality, farm subsidies play little role in the economic conditions of rural America. And again, in light of what happened in the election, it's an especially important time to be looking deeply at the role that subsidies play in the health of rural America. And as the authors explain, farm subsidies overwhelmingly flow to the largest producers of bulk commodities. This shouldn't surprise any of us. Some of you may know EWG FOIAs from USDA data on farm subsidies, and we publish it through our farm subsidy database. And we've looked back now to 1995, the year, and have data going from 1995 to 2014. And what we found is that 77% of all farm subsidies during that period between 1995 and 2014 flowed to the largest 10% of subsidy recipients. The top 1%, the top 1% of farm subsidy recipients received 26% of all farm subsidies. And that means that roughly 30,000 of the very largest farm businesses in the United States received $46 billion, or about $1.57 million per farm business over the last 20 years. And while some of these very large and large commercial operations receive more than $1 million annually in support, income support from USDA because of the reasons we've heard about. The bottom 80% of subsidy recipients receive about $10,000 a year or less. And that's not, unless we forget that about 62% of farmers are simply ineligible for subsidies of any kind because they raise livestock. So, or as the authors of the paper put it, perhaps a little bit more politely than Scott Faber at EWG would, while farm subsidies transfer income from taxpayers to farm owners, most of the direct beneficiaries are relatively wealthy. And I would contend that's sort of an understatement. The median wealth, and I think Vince alluded to this, of the nation's 50,000 largest, very large in the typology that USDA uses, very large commercial farms, those farms that collect the lion's share of these subsidies, have a median wealth of $6.9 million, according to the most recent family farm report produced by ERS. It's also worth noting that not only do these subsidies not flow to the vast majority of farmers, many of these subsidies also happen to flow to people who live in cities, including, oddly enough, the man who might be the next Secretary of Agriculture. It might be worth just investigating or asking or wondering, why would someone who has probably not been a farmer as defined by any common sense definition or even a congressional definition, since he left his family farm to go to college 50 years ago, why would somebody who is not a farmer in any normal sense of the word have collected almost $300,000 in farm subsidies? And he's not alone. Thousands and thousands of city slickers have collected millions of dollars of farm subsidies. So it's hard to see how those subsidies would in any way benefit rural America. But as the authors talk about in the paper, which is excellent, these gross inequities in our farm subsidy system are not the only reasons that farm subsidies fail to contribute to rural development. As we heard from Parke, farming only accounts for 6% of employment in non-metro counties, which means that farming employs far fewer people than transportation, utilities, manufacturing, and services. Farm workers and rural residents and others in farm-related occupations receive little additional income as a result of these programs. And of course, despite the warnings of a farm crisis, and Parke noted this as well, farm household income is growing. And even as the price of some bulk commodities return to normal, USDA projects that median farm income will be about $20,000 higher than the median income of non-farm households. And I think, as you also mentioned, Parke, very large and very large commercial farms reported median farm income, household income of $340,000 and $1.1 million respectively in 2015. So the truth is that most farm households not only don't face the risk of poverty, most farm households enjoy income, median income, that's well above the median income of ordinary American households. And what's interesting to look at, and maybe this is a next paper, is that many of the counties that receive the most subsidies, counties like Hale County in Texas or Poinsett County in Arkansas, are also among the counties that have the highest rates of poverty in the United States. Which also seems to really drive home the point that subsidy programs aren't ultimately addressing certainly rural poverty, if that's indeed the goal that we set out for them. So do farm subsidies benefit rural America? I think our experts have made it very clear. USDA does do many things to promote rural development, but agriculture subsidy programs are not central to that effort. Thank you.
Would you like to each take a couple of minutes to respond to the comments?
Yeah.
Joe?
Yeah, and let me just make three. And the first one is Stephanie's, and I appreciate the comments. I thought they were right on, and I think that particularly this whole issue about, well, what didn't we talk about is that's fair game. I think those are some very important points. want to address a couple of those. But the one thing that I would disagree on is the comparison, the cross-country comparison of the U.S. compared to other countries. The problem with that is it doesn't take into account, a lot of countries don't take into account food away from home in those numbers, or it's very unclear. So ERS, in fact, has, while they still keep those numbers on a spreadsheet, they don't really highlight them much. And I know back to my days when, as chief economist, we got very, very nervous whenever someone wanted to use those numbers in that sort of way, because they just don't work. They work very well comparing France in 2015 compared to France in 2008 because they're taken from consistent sources. But unfortunately, we don't have a consistent comparison across countries. So it's very misleading to say that US is cheaper than, say, some other country. I mean, there are clearly countries that you could make that claim, and I'm sure you would be right, but from that data itself, you have to be very, very careful in making those comparisons. Now, the other point that you make, though, I think is and Scott touched on as well, is spot on, and that is, well, there's a lot of things in a farm bill. And we're really talking about the price and income support programs, and even where some of the environmental programs are addressed, we don't really address the environmental benefits. What we really say is, what are the impacts, or at least when I was looking at that, what are the impacts on food prices and that sort of thing. So research and development, absolutely, and I tried to make that point in just the one slide there. I think there's no question, and I think as at least as an aside in that paper, we do make that point that there's no question that research and development has had a huge impact on commodity prices over time, and that, I think, the work that ERS has done on that, the work that Julian Alston, Phil Pardee have done. There's a number of people who have documented that what is important is a sustained expenditures on research and development. That's what has driven these productivity gains. And those are things that not just the US benefits, but obviously the world benefits. So that's all good. The other titles that you mentioned, rural development, I think that too, I mean, that can be judged on its own merit, but we don't really treat it here primarily because we really were focused on what the impacts on price. And the other thing, of course, the other elephant in the room are the nutrition programs that we don't talk about. They're very, very, obviously very, very important. You may want to say a few words on that, Parke, but that's a very different aspect entirely, and they do have a very big impact on poor people. So,
Hawk. Sure. Well, on the nutrition program, it's nice of you to sort of give a guy who's an economist in a nutrition school a lead in, because I have to point out some things about the nutrition programs that are immune to some of the criticisms that we had about the farm programs. Because, for example, they're targeted at food across the board rather than picking particular sectors of food production to focus on. In a way, they lift all boats. They're not trade distorting in the same way that farm programs can be, depending on which particular farm program we're talking about. But the other thing is, as we think about nutrition among the poor, we're thinking about what reduces poverty overall. And I think across the political spectrum, whether you're liberal or whether you're conservative, there's a lot of there's a lot of ideas out there about poverty reduction that are pursued sometimes with energy and sometimes with a lack of energy that's notable. And so I think those probably matter more. Stephanie pointed out housing programs in rural areas, and I think nutrition programs, the effect of, for example, the SNAP program in rural areas could have been added. As I heard, but when we started this project, we were worried about, can we really make the case? And by the time we ended the project, I would say the thing we were worried most about was what Stephanie was hardest on, which is whether anybody was really claiming that. And so, boy, was I relieved that Scott's comments, which helped reassure that it wasn't a straw dummy. So I appreciate having those quotes. In fact, we looked for some like that and didn't find quite the same good ones that you did. And so thanks for that.
We're really happy to take any questions that you have. If you, when you speak, could say who you are and if you have an affiliation with whom you're affiliated, that would be great. Yes, ma'am.
Vince, I might throw.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize, Dan.
Dan.
I've committed the ultimate faux pas of ignoring the man that's not really in the room.
for it.
Please accept my apologies, Dan.
All right. Just a couple of quick things. Obviously, Stephanie's point about R&D affecting long-term trends in productivity on farms and thereby food prices is certainly right. In the long haul, it's certainly not anything that has a few-year turnaround. We're talking about decades when you talk about agricultural R&D. The other thing we have to acknowledge is that the U.S. agricultural R&D enterprise has never been focused on a nutritional. I'm talking about farm agricultural R&D has never been focused on nutrition per se. And of course, there are people that complain about that. And this relates to obesity and such things. We also, we do lots of R&D in improving agricultural productivity for commodities that we export, for example. We don't focus on, say, fruits and vegetables or other things that the nutritionists would like us to. Now, I have a lot out here in California, I have a lot in the food and vegetables wished more of the federal R&D dollars focused on their crops, which they claim are better for diets than, say, Midwest crops. But that's not the issue, of course, that we focused on. But I think if we're going to talk about R&D and nutrition and food security of the poor, it is reasonable to ask about R&D in a food security policy sense. And Scott raised a couple of good points about the effects of farm programs on general incomes in rural America. And of course, that was also not our main point. And because even if it were true that farm programs were good for rural America in general, that wouldn't mean that they were good for the poor. And we do not really investigate in any detail the question is, are farm programs a good rural development policy? That is a topic that AEI will be dealing with as we get into this farm policy season, but it isn't really the main focus of our paper, and I wanted to make that clarification before before someone thinks that this paper dealt thoroughly with that question. I'll stop there and put my phone back on mute.
Dan, thank you so much. So I have a question at the front, and then I have a question. I saw you, sir, and I'll try and be as equitable as I can.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation and this discussion. Food program and agricultural subsidies, I think they really affect not only the rural, the poor, but also the general population, the consumers. It's not only affect the price, but also their distribution. So your presentation usually is generally in a very macro sense. In what I say is, could you really provide information exactly whether the farmer or the poor, they really receive the benefit supposedly targeted to them, or they are really deprived of by somebody in the middleman or agencies? And then whether the poor in their income or family income, not just individually, they usually have to subsidize among the family members, whether they really have to distribute their income for other sectors like transportation. If their mobility is very poor, they're going to come and visit to the city. Like this time they come to the Washington, D.C. for protests, then their income or their subsidies or their food program, they will really have to be diverted to their lodging, and then maybe after that, probably they lost a lot of income because of all the transportation costs. There's a problem there because not just you pay.
Can you give us one short question?
My short question is, really, can you describe any statistical data or really family fact or evidence to describe whether the poor or the farmer really receive the benefit, and after that, whether those benefits compared to other expenditure on other sectors really make any difference?
Thank you.
Yeah. So two things. One, where do these benefits go? And I think most studies indicate that where a lot of the farm program, and particularly the farm income supports go, they tend to be capitalized into land values. So land values increase because these programs, for the most part, are targeted to the land that's operated, not to the specific farmer, but it's by dint of owning historical corn base, for example. And so that land, when you're paying for historical corn production, those payments tend to get bid up into the price of land. Now, one can differ, and studies differ in terms of how much of that gets bid in there. The other point is how much the fact that farm value is so low relative to retail food prices. I think most analyses show that the food industry actually is fairly competitive. And so I don't think that people are holding enormous profits in middlemen are reaping enormous profits that are somehow making the fact that underlying price movements for, say, wheat or whatever aren't being transmitted to bread. I think it's just the fact that to produce a loaf of bread, there are a lot of things that go into that production, and wheat is a very small component of that. And labor costs continue to go up, whereas wheat prices, have we seen in real terms, have declined. So I think that because of that, you see very little variation in consumer prices. That is, they tend to increase by about 1% to 2% per year for food prices, whereas commodity prices may be all over the map during a period. Do you want to add anything?
Go ahead.
Well, I want to make sure other people get a chance for a
very
question.
sure.
And this gentleman, and then you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force, and we have several categories of projects. One of the projects is to brand local areas, including rural area or especially rural area. We work successfully so far, mostly in Japan and in Scandinavia. Very little work in developing countries and not at all in the United States. First question, do you think if you engage in better documenting the cultural heritage, natural heritage traditions in local areas, specifically in rural area in the United States, could be an opening or to enable better education, community rebuilding, economic development? First question. Second question, there are technologies which we call them game changers. One of the technologies seems to emerge is non-chemical fertilizers, which can be used by small farmers. Is it applicable of interest in the United States? To the best of my understanding, there are technologies available. They can produce their own non-chemical fertilizers. It seems it could be a game changer. I hope it makes sense. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Parke, do you want to take that one? Or Dan?
Sure. Dan, did you hear the question? And do you want to take first on a comment on small, local, and heritage-oriented agriculture? He's on mute.
Take that mute off, Dan.
Yeah. In that case, I'm going to go for it. And so in the United States, probably even among the authors, thinking about what is our approach to sort of this huge amount of public energy in local, sustainable, organic, heritage-oriented, and including non-chemical agriculture, there might be a diversity of opinion. But there's two separate questions. One is, should consumers take interest in this? And a separate question is, should this be a large part of farm subsidy programs? And I think you'd have all three, even if we had slight difference of opinion on some part of that, you'd probably have us in agreement that that probably doesn't merit a large fraction of a large investment from the federal government in terms of subsidies. In part, in my view, because it's so diverse, because the needs of local places are so diverse, that if you had the federal government in a heavy way subsidizing it, that it would be trying to use something that by nature has to be sort of fixed and disciplined and national in scope, fit a whole lot of local context situations. So for myself, I patronize these farmers without recommending major changes in US agricultural subsidies to them.
Okay, next question here, and I'm ignoring people over here, and I apologize. Yeah. So this gentleman and then that gentleman.
I'm Edward Fine. Dr. Edward Fine. I'm professor of neurology at the University of Buffalo. My practice is with neuropathies. Mostly, neuropathies are diseases that affect the peripheral nerves. Okay. Now, when you take my downtown practice, which is mostly inner city patients, almost 90% of them that I see have prediabetes or diabetes, and they're almost all have body mass indexes anywhere from 30 to 57% BMIs. 57 BMI is really fatal. It takes off about 8 to 10 years of your life. Okay, would you suggest is to get a better knowledge of nutrition to the poor? When you see them, they come in with a bottle full of high fructose sugar containing beverages, or aspartame, which gives them migraines, and they have no knowledge of this. And basically, the practice is to teach them to eat better, to take them to a nutritionist. And many physicians in these so-called, I'll call them Medicaid mills, if you wish, have never sent one of their patients to a nutritionist who'll teach them portion control and good food content. So what could the USDA do, or what any federal agency do? And how should the budgets be changed to help these people? We could cut disease down tremendously.
Let me pass this straight to Parke Wilde, while noting that not how we're currently spending money on support for farmers. It seems to be the message. Would that be right, Parke? No, exactly.
It's very much a good question. And so I should start by saying that none of our skepticism that farm programs help the nutrition of the poor should be treated as being dismissive of the importance of nutrition for low-income Americans, much like for middle-income and high-income Americans also. There's a gradient there, but it's a gradient that's a matter of degree, not a major sea change. Most Americans are not healthy eaters at present, and there's high rates of chronic disease across the board. So you mentioned nutrition education. USDA invests substantially in nutrition education, both through the SNAP program and through non-SNAP vehicles. And also you could mention interest. There's really a number of things that the federal government does by promoting dietary guidance and other things to pursue this. Each of them is controversial. There's pushback from people concerned about the nanny state. So really each of these is a contested area of public policy. But I take your point very strongly and favorably.
Next question is here, then.
And then we're going to let Dan voice
Sorry,
on
Dan.
this also. Yeah.
Yeah, let me add just one quick reference here. I'm engaged in a major multi-year effort here in California on obesity and particularly diabetes issues for hired farm workers, unrelated to farm subsidy programs. These are in actually workers in the fruit industry that is pretty much removed from the kind of programs we're talking about here, funded by NIH with a bunch of people from the med school. And some people are surprised that hired farm workers who get more exercise on the job than most people still have these obesity problems, and poor dietary patterns are certainly central to it. But also a lack of exercise outside the job and other habits in life that many of us suffer from. So I think this issue is in rural America, it's urban, it's really everywhere. We should note that, of course, as Parke says, it's not a farm subsidy issue, but I think lots of parts of the federal government are taking different parts of this question. It's also true that, of course, state government efforts and private firms. And what I find most exciting about the program that we're working on it's actually private agricultural firms, it's farms that are helping to sponsor this program because they want a healthier workforce. And the more that we can create incentives for individual companies, including farming companies, to take an interest, an active interest, and recognize that it can affect their own bottom lines, the more we can make progress here. I will also say that part of USDA funding for the Agricultural Extension Service also has lots of programs out in the counties scattered throughout the United States. states dealing with nutrition, everything from 4-H club programs for the young to nutrition programs for young mothers and on around the cycle. So the bigger question isn't, I think, do we do enough in this area? Maybe we don't, but what's the effectiveness of what we have done? And I think the programs themselves are open to indictment, because as much effort as the government has spent telling people they're too fat and they ought to do something about it, it doesn't seem to have been all that successful.
Let's the gentleman here.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Vince. My name is Eric Munoz with Oxfam. Congratulations to the panel. It's a very nice paper. I look forward to reading it. Questions about where we might go from here. I'm particularly seized by the comments around inequality and the way in which the current set of farm support programs don't necessarily address inequality or moderate inequality. And we see the very large percentage of farm subsidy being captured by a very small percentage of farmers. So given that the paper doesn't necessarily go into policy recommendations, this is but it is a policy issue to which I'm relatively interested in. What would your recommendations be if the policy goal we're trying to achieve is actually trying to moderate inequality in rural areas, assuming that that's an issue that is a problem, which I think we agree it is, and that is a solution we're trying to work towards. Is it means testing? Is it changing the set of commodities that we're providing supports from? Are there other solutions that might be useful towards that objective? Thank you.
Joe?
No, I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, the reason these program payments are so skewed is they do tend to be tied to production. And if you look at production, the amount of production, the percent of production that is produced by what percent of the farm population, that has gotten more and more concentrated over time. And in fact, if you look at every census, certainly I just went back in a paper I just did back to 74 census, all the way forward. Every year there's more concentration, more highly concentration, even though the number of farms actually has flattened out. So you still see this structural movement towards larger and larger farms. So it's tied to production. What should you do about it? Well, one way to do it is to address it with means testing. The problem with those approaches is people get around them, and they're very difficult to write airtight rules on that. I mean, frankly, and this is a much broader question about farm subsidies, I'm all for phasing them out, frankly, and getting rid of the inequality problem that way. I think what does get affected, obviously, are things like land values and other things, but it's really a small percent of land values. I mean, what drives land values are as much interest rates and prices and income prospects over time, and I think farm income has actually been a pretty minor part of that for the last number of years.
Next question. The gentleman right there, yes.
Yes, Jerry Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report. What strikes me about what you say about this not affecting food prices is that I get a constant stream of emails from leftist groups, I would say, that are arguing that the subsidies for corn and soybeans and wheat, et cetera, are leading to those foods being cheaper than fruits and vegetables. And they advocate taking some kind of action to increase the fruit and vegetable production. I believe they want to lower the prices, which the fruit and vegetable industry doesn't like, because they say these foods have very high costs of production because of the hand picking and all of this. But when you say this, that it doesn't affect food prices, what do you think about this issue? And this goes to what the physician was talking about what people are eating and what foods are priced at what prices there are on these foods.
I'm going to ask Dan if he would like to comment on that, because of the people sitting here, Dan Sumner knows more about the fruits and vegetables industry than most of us, because he sits in California in the Central Valley.
And so did you hear the question? Yeah.
Yes, I heard the question, and thank you. It's certainly a popular topic out here. Folks at Western Growers and other places emphasize this. And you're right, they're not an advocate for lower prices in general, but they're an advocate for larger supplies. And I think there's a strong nutritional argument for suggesting the more we can do to open up markets and stimulate supplies, and at the very least not bias production against the kinds of fruits and vegetables that most people know are healthy in diets. Where we want to be careful, of course, is to not do things that raise prices or reduce availability, like import restrictions or things like that. And here I will come back to Stephanie's point. Over the long haul, can we do more to increase R&D in these areas? R&D in all the way up and down the spectrum, whether it's making just standard yield improvements, but also post-harvest handling, other ways to get more of the product available to people and actually used by people. And those are all challenges. One of the things we've done over the years by emphasizing fresh fruits and vegetables is probably undervalue the nutritional benefits of frozen fruits and vegetables, for example, which are relatively cheap compared to fresh fruits and vegetables, and by most nutritionists' estimates, equally good for the diet. So I think we have a long way to go there. I look more at issues like R&D, particularly in post-harvest handling, as ways to get products available. I can't help but note that among the things we've done in the United States is essentially block serious R&D and product development in modern biotechnology or any sort of modern biology applied to fruits and vegetables. I think that's an unfortunate policy choice we've made, and it's not perhaps consciously made in Washington as is much made indirectly through all the other choices we make in this country, but it has had some unfortunate consequences about prices of fruits and vegetables, I think.
So both Parke and Joe Glauber would like also to comment on this. So Parke?
Sure.
And Scott. And in fact, they all want to talk about this.
Yeah.
So but briefly, because I want to take one or two more questions from the floor before we wrap up.
I just want to get back to Jerry's first point, and that is we make a big point here saying that farm programs have little impact on prices. Absolutely, and it applies equally to against the arguments that we have a cheap corn policy that promotes the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. I think there's plenty of reasons to look at high fructose corn syrup. I'm not or sweetener consumption and obesity, but I don't think you can pin that on the problem on payments, farm and price and income support payments, because largely they've been decoupled. They've had very little impact on that. And again, back to the retail price of these commodities, that the price of corn is pretty small component of something like a liter of Coke. So you change the price of corn very much, you have almost no impact on the price of Coke.
Parke?
I just want to say I spend a lot of time talking to audiences who are very, very much sort of come to the conversation believing this. And so I feel like it takes a bit of practice to get over the astonishment that people express when they first hear that you don't actually believe that farm subsidy programs cause obesity. But it requires talking through the nature of the different vehicles that the USDA programs use for addressing different types of agricultural issues. What's the difference between a deficiency payment that could in principle be price suppressing from a crop insurance payment or from a direct payment that is unlikely to be price suppressing, and what are the other things that increase prices? And usually what ends up being persuasive on this, because you'll find most agricultural economists really quite confident on this point.
Yeah, the other side of the coin is that farmers who produce fruits and vegetables don't want direct subsidies. And those who are advocating, I don't think ever had conversations with those groups to ask them.
Scott?
And I'll just add in, and this paper, as well as the two papers that Joe cited, and countless other papers have shown that subsidies ultimately have very little impact on the choices that farmers make with regards to which crops to grow. Having said that, Anyone who's ever looked at the RMA Book of Business is certainly aware that I think it's now 140 different crops participate in the government subsidized crop insurance program. About $500 million of the $7 billion or so that we provide in crop insurance subsidies now flow to fruit and vegetable farmers. So it's certainly not the case that fruit and vegetable farmers are covered commodities that receive subsidies, as Henry Wallace might have thought of them, but they are now participating certainly in the crop insurance program in a way that I don't think anyone would have imagined even 20 years ago. So the only thing I'll just add is certainly there are ways that the government can help promote greater fruit and vegetable consumption. Some of those are ideas that Senator Stabenow began to cultivate in the last Farm Bill. But as Joe and Parke and Dan pointed out in their paper, there are other things that the government does that ultimately increase the price of fruits and vegetables, including certainly trade restrictions and marketing orders that also ought to be looked at as part of this broader conversation about price and availability. I think you use the example of fresh market tomatoes as one of the many crops that ultimately we pay more for as consumers because of some of the market interventions made by our government.
So I'm going to take the gentleman at the way back because I've been ignoring the back row. And then I'll have time for one more question, and I won't ignore you.
Hi, on to Greeny. I have a coffee company. So I'm curious, as far as the price of fruits and vegetables, perhaps there's better gains to be made as far as lowering those prices if we focus rather than at the production end, but more at, say, the retail end. And if we go into a store like Whole Foods versus, say, Aldi's or like some corner bodega, which you can get vegetables at like half the price or a third of the price, is it viable to perhaps take some subsidies and assign them in a different way to promote these other business models?
That's what Senator Stabenow began to do in the last Farm Bill, where by providing call it a subsidy, if you will, a bonus payment for SNAP recipients purchasing fruits and vegetables at farmers markets, for example. So there certainly are ideas being cultivated.
Small scale.
It's very small scale.
Dan, would you like to comment on that question?
No, that's all right. I think you can move along, Vince.
Okay.
And I did have a second part, if I may. You choose
By all means.
Is meat artificially low priced? And I seem to be hearing that the subsidies don't have an impact, and I find that really hard to believe.
Believe it. By and large, it's a fair comment. There are still subsidies for wool, so that affects lamb, but you all eat very, very little lamb. And when I say you all, the average consumption of lamb in this country is around about 1 pound per year, something like that. It's astonishingly low to an Englishman.
Well, let me just say a couple things because, okay, so where would the subsidies impact and lower the cost for a livestock producer? There are things like grazing, what some would say are reduced fees for grazing, out in the West. I think those are pretty small in terms of what the overall impact would be on cattle because they're sort of dwarfed. And I'm really talking now of beef prices, not retail beef prices, but pre-processing. So remember that retail prices are only 50%. The farm value is only 50% of the retail price. But on top of that, then you do have for things like poultry and hogs and finishing cattle. You do feed them things like soybeans and corn, but again, there it shows pretty small pass-through. Why? Because those programs have been largely decoupled from subsidies. You get those subsidies whether you plant corn or not. You can plant another crop, and in some cases, you don't even have to plant a crop. You can put it in conserved use, and you get that. So most of the studies have shown, in pretty broad agreement on it, that they have very minimal impact on corn production, and hence very little impact on livestock because they're the ones consuming it. Now, Well, I guess I know I had one other point to make on it, but I'm going to pass.
That's what I'll make, I think, what was his other point. The renewable fuel standards clearly have an impact.
That was it.
By taking
Vince, I will
product
add
off the
one
market.
point there, if I can.
Yeah, sure, please, Dan.
And it's simply this. You can go commodity by commodity and find that farm programs may well, including crop insurance, can stimulate production of a single commodity, but something that stimulates more corn production may well be drawing land out of soybeans. The soybeans are also used for those cattle to feed cattle and hogs, etc. And if you reduce subsidies for corn and soybeans, perhaps in some places you'll grow more hay, for example, but that's also used for livestock feed. So the whole complex of farm subsidy programs, including crop insurance, as a whole, do much less to affect what farmers grow than individual subsidies taken one by one. And we've, for example, looked at individual subsidies one by one for certain fruits and vegetables. And we're going to find, in research that's not quite done yet, I think we'll find that if you add a particular fruit or vegetable into a crop insurance subsidy program, you may well stimulate some acreage for that particular thing. But that's not saying that the whole complex of subsidies changes the mix of crops grown very much. It's a technical point, but it's one that I think is worth keeping in mind.
And just to come back to the renewable fuel standard, that if you talk to livestock lobbying groups, they view that as a tax because it tends to create another source of demand for the feed that they want. Last question from the lady in the front. Well, lady in the second row.
I can speak up. Oh, never mind. Okay. Hi, my name is Eilish. I'm currently interning on the Hill. However, a lot of my undergraduate time was dedicated to agriculture and the way in which that influences local economies, small-scale farms, and whatnot. And so I was curious if you spoke to the fact that a lot of the farm programs and the subsidies go to large or very large farms. Excuse me. And so could you speak to the way in which those subsidies may or may not contribute to the purchasing power of these large or very large farms, and that the connection to the loss of small-scale farms throughout the United States, and how that in turn could actually influence the price of food, or if it does or if it does not influence the price of food.
So which of the speakers would like to address that?
I think it's Joe or Stephanie.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that.
Right.
I think the studies show, again, very minimal impact. I mean, you're really talking farm payments in the grand scheme of things. When you're talking about $400 billion worth of crop and livestock receipts, and then you're comparing that to a few $billion in subsidies, it's a pretty small piece to begin with. And I think Parke's analysis shows, again, these comparisons on median income compared to other households, non-farm households. Farm households tend to have a lot of income. Now, the farm sector, if there's one thing I learned over 30 years, is very heterogeneous. So there are some farms that I presume, we know there are limited resource farmers that are living near poverty and struggling to maybe don't have the human capital to get good off-farm jobs, or the lack of employment opportunities in the county or whatever. But they also are the ones that aren't receiving very many subsidies. So getting rid of subsidies doesn't really affect the poverty per se. There probably are better ways to address poverty, and again, that's not really the argument today on how to do that, but it's just to say that farm subsidies are a pretty blunt instrument, and in fact, for addressing things like farm poverty, pretty poor. And I think the general feeling is, a consensus among economists is, if one were to get rid of these programs, one wouldn't see a loss of farm production, that we wouldn't begin importing all of our needs. I think the U.S. will continue to be a very big supplier to the world, and we will be a growing supplier to the world.
On that note, a couple of, I'd like to just intervene for a moment. over the next year, a whole series of papers will be coming out of the American Enterprise Institute's National Agricultural Research Program from the leading economists who write on issues like direct subsidies to farmers, like conservation policy, like the issues that Dan raised on the farm-to-market structure. And those papers will be coming out over the next 12 months to inform the Farm Bill discussions that we know are taking place now and provide a somewhat independent from farm interest group perspective that reflects where leading economists, leading scholars both in the United States and the rest of the world come down on how those programs affect the broader community as well as within the farm community, whether it is the small farms or the large farms that are benefiting, and whether these policies actually affect agriculture in the way that often we hear claimed in more polemical environments. I'd like to thank the audience for your patience, your interest, and your very intriguing questions. And I'd like to thank the authors of our study and our commentators for their insights. I hope you found it as interesting and as informative as I have. Thank you so much.